Question 1. Stakeholder feedback indicates a need for clearer guidance on licensee responsibilities during law enforcement encounters in Indiana. A licensed individual is driving and is stopped by a police officer for a minor traffic violation. The individual is aware they are carrying a handgun, for which they possess a valid Indiana license to carry handgun. What is the most appropriate and legally compliant course of action for the licensee? Option A. Attempt to conceal the handgun or act as if you are unaware of your license. Option B. Only inform the officer about the handgun after the officer has discovered it during a search. Option C. Immediately and clearly inform the law enforcement officer that you are carrying a handgun and are licensed to do so in Indiana. Option D. Wait for the officer to ask if you are carrying any weapons before disclosing the presence of the handgun. The correct answer is C. Immediately and clearly inform the law enforcement officer that you are carrying a handgun and are licensed to do so in Indiana. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to navigate the nuances of Indiana law regarding the lawful carrying of a handgun, specifically when encountering law enforcement. Misinterpreting or failing to adhere to these regulations can lead to serious legal consequences, including arrest and prosecution, despite possessing a valid license. The core challenge lies in understanding the specific duties imposed upon a licensee when interacting with a law enforcement officer. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves immediately and clearly informing the law enforcement officer that you are carrying a handgun and are licensed to do so in Indiana. This approach is correct because Indiana Code Section 35-47-2-1C 1. Mandates that a person who has a valid license to carry a handgun and is carrying a handgun must inform a law enforcement officer of the fact that the person is carrying a handgun and display the handgun to the officer upon request. Prompt and direct communication ensures compliance with the law, minimizes potential misunderstandings, and demonstrates respect for the officer's duties and safety concerns. This proactive disclosure is crucial for a lawful and safe interaction. Incorrect approaches analysis. Failing to inform the officer and instead waiting for the officer to discover the handgun is a significant regulatory failure. Indiana law explicitly requires the licensee to inform the officer. This inaction could be misconstrued as an attempt to conceal the weapon, leading to heightened suspicion and potential legal repercussions under Indiana Code Section 35-47-2-1C. 1. Attempting to conceal the handgun or feigning ignorance about the license is also a regulatory failure. The law requires disclosure, not concealment or evasion. Such actions directly violate the spirit and letter of Indiana's handgun licensing laws and could be interpreted as obstruction or intent to deceive, leading to severe penalties. Only informing the officer after being asked about weapons, without proactively stating you are carrying a handgun, is also a failure to fully comply with the spirit of the law. While the law mentions displaying the handgun upon request, the primary duty is to inform the officer of its presence. Delaying this information, even if eventually provided when prompted, misses the opportunity for immediate transparency and could still create a tense or uncertain situation for the officer, potentially leading to a less favorable outcome. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach interactions with law enforcement while carrying a handgun with a mindset of full transparency and strict adherence to state law. Decision-making process should prioritize understanding and complying with specific statutory requirements, such as those found in Indiana Code Section 35-47-2-1. When encountering law enforcement, the immediate priority is to de-escalate any potential tension by clearly and calmly informing the officer of the handgun and the valid Indiana license. This proactive disclosure is the cornerstone of responsible and lawful conduct. Question 2. The risk matrix shows a potential for increased scrutiny regarding firearm possession and transport within Indiana. Considering Indiana's legal framework for carrying handguns, which of the following actions best demonstrates responsible and lawful conduct when transporting a handgun in a vehicle? Option A. Transporting the handgun in a manner that is easily visible to others, believing that open display signifies lawful intent. Option B. Ensuring the handgun is unloaded, securely stored in a case, and not readily accessible for immediate use while in the vehicle, in accordance with Indiana Code. Option C. Relying on the general right to bear arms guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution to carry a loaded handgun openly or concealed in the vehicle. Option D. carrying a loaded handgun in the passenger compartment of the vehicle, assuming it is legally owned, and no specific prohibition is immediately apparent. Correct answer is B. Ensuring the handgun is unloaded, securely stored in a case, and not readily accessible for immediate use while in the vehicle, in accordance with Indiana Code. Explanation: the risk matrix shows a potential for increased scrutiny regarding firearm possession and transport within Indiana. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to navigate the specific legal requirements for carrying a handgun in Indiana, while also being aware of potential public perception and the need to avoid actions that could be misinterpreted as unlawful or threatening. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with Indiana Code and to maintain public safety and trust. The best professional approach involves understanding and strictly adhering to the Indiana Code provisions governing the lawful carrying of a handgun. This includes possessing a valid Indiana license to carry handgun, LTCH, or meeting the statutory exceptions, ensuring the handgun is unloaded and securely stored when not in immediate possession, and being aware of prohibited locations. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with Indiana's legal framework for firearm possession and carry, prioritizing lawful conduct and minimizing legal risk. It demonstrates a commitment to responsible gun ownership and adherence to state statutes, an approach that relies solely on the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution without considering specific Indiana statutes is incorrect. While the Second Amendment protects the right to bear arms, Indiana law imposes specific regulations and requirements for carrying handguns, such as the LTCH. Failing to obtain the required license or follow state-specific transport laws would be a violation of Indiana Code, regardless of a general understanding of constitutional rights. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that because a handgun is legally owned, it can be carried openly or concealed anywhere within Indiana without further consideration of state laws. Indiana Code specifies where handguns can and cannot be carried, and open carry may be subject to specific conditions or prohibitions depending on the location and circumstances. This approach disregards the detailed regulations that govern the actual act of carrying a handgun in public. Finally, an approach that involves carrying a loaded handgun in a vehicle without a valid LTCH, or in a manner that is readily accessible and visible, is also incorrect. Indiana law has specific provisions regarding the transport of handguns in vehicles, often requiring them to be unloaded and in a case, or subject to other restrictions if carried openly or concealed without a license. This demonstrates a failure to understand and comply with critical Indiana statutes designed to regulate firearm transport and public safety. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding and compliance with the specific laws of the jurisdiction in which they are operating. This involves thorough research of relevant statutes, seeking clarification from legal authorities if necessary, and consistently applying these laws to their actions. A proactive approach to legal compliance, rather than a reactive one, is essential for responsible firearm ownership and carry. Question 3. Operational review demonstrates that an individual holding a valid Indiana license to carry handgun is attending a religious service at a church in Indianapolis. Considering the specific regulations and ethical considerations surrounding firearm carriage in Indiana, what is the most prudent and legally compliant course of action for this individual regarding their handgun? Option A. Inform other congregants about the presence of the handgun to foster a sense of security. Option B. Carry the handgun concealed, ensuring it is not visible and taking no actions that could reasonably cause alarm to others present. Option C. Leave the handgun unsecured in their vehicle parked outside the church. Option D. Display the handgun openly on their person to ensure immediate access in case of an emergency. The correct answer is B. Carry the handgun concealed, ensuring it is not visible and taking no actions that could reasonably cause alarm to others present. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate the nuanced requirements of Indiana's license to carry handgun law while also considering the ethical implications of their actions. The core challenge lies in balancing the legal right to carry a handgun with the responsibility to do so in a manner that does not create undue alarm or violate public safety, especially in a setting where individuals might be more vulnerable. Careful judgment is required to interpret the spirit of the law, not just its letter, and to act with discretion. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves understanding that while Indiana law permits carrying a handgun under certain conditions, it does not grant an unfettered right to display it in a manner that could be perceived as threatening or intimidating, particularly in a place of worship. The correct approach is to carry the handgun concealed, in compliance with Indiana Code 35-47-2-1, which outlines the requirements for a license to carry a handgun, and to avoid any actions that could reasonably cause alarm or be interpreted as brandishing. This approach respects the law, the environment, and the peace of mind of others. It prioritizes responsible and discreet firearm ownership. Incorrect approaches analysis. Displaying the handgun openly, even if legally permitted in some contexts, is professionally unacceptable in this scenario. This action directly violates the principle of responsible firearm carriage by potentially causing fear and distress to others, which is contrary to the public safety aspect implicitly expected of all license holders. Furthermore, it could be construed as brandishing under Indiana Code 35-47-4-6, even if not explicitly intended as such, due to the context of a place of worship. Another incorrect approach would be to leave the handgun unsecured in a vehicle. This is a significant security risk and a failure to maintain control over the firearm, which is a fundamental responsibility of a license holder. Indiana law, while not explicitly detailing vehicle storage for concealed carry permit holders, emphasizes the licensee's responsibility for the firearm's safekeeping. Finally, discussing the presence of the handgun with others in a casual or boastful manner is also professionally unacceptable. This behavior can create unnecessary anxiety and may be perceived as irresponsible or provocative, undermining the discreet and responsible image expected of a licensed carrier. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach situations involving the carrying of firearms with a strong emphasis on discretion, responsibility, and adherence to the spirit of the law. This involves a continuous assessment of the environment and the potential impact of their actions on others. The decision-making framework should prioritize minimizing risk, avoiding alarm, and upholding the trust placed in licensed firearm carriers. When in doubt, erring on the side of caution and discretion is the most professional course of action. Question 4. Quality control measures reveal a licensee in Indiana who possesses a valid license to carry handgun is frequently observed carrying their handgun into establishments that have clear "no firearms" signage posted at their entrances. Considering the regulatory framework of Indiana, which of the following best describes the licensee's adherence to the law? Option A. The licensee's actions are permissible as long as they are discreet and do not cause alarm to others. Option B. The licensee is compliant as long as the establishment does not explicitly state that firearms are prohibited by law but merely by policy. Option C. The licensee is violating Indiana law by carrying a handgun into a prohibited location, irrespective of their valid license status. Option D. The licensee is in full compliance with Indiana law as long as they possess a valid license to carry handgun and do not brandish the weapon. The correct answer is D. The licensee is in full compliance with Indiana law as long as they possess a valid license to carry handgun and do not brandish the weapon. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to balance the immediate need for self-defense with the legal obligations and responsibilities associated with carrying a handgun in Indiana. Misinterpreting or disregarding these obligations can lead to severe legal consequences, including the loss of the license to carry a handgun and potential criminal charges. The decision-making process must prioritize adherence to Indiana law while ensuring personal safety. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves understanding and strictly adhering to Indiana Code Title 35, Article 47, Chapter 11, 1, which governs the license to carry handgun. This approach emphasizes that the license permits carrying a handgun under specific conditions and does not grant carte blanche to carry it in any location or manner. It requires the licensee to be aware of and comply with all restrictions, such as prohibitions against carrying in certain public buildings, or while under the influence of alcohol or controlled substances. The ethical justification lies in respecting the legal framework designed to balance individual rights with public safety. This approach ensures that the licensee acts responsibly and within the bounds of the law, thereby upholding the integrity of the licensing system and contributing to public order. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves assuming that possessing a valid license to carry handgun in Indiana automatically permits carrying a handgun into any establishment, regardless of posted signage or specific prohibitions. This fails to acknowledge that the license is subject to numerous statutory restrictions outlined in Indiana law. Another incorrect approach is to believe that the license negates the need to exercise discretion regarding the carrying of a handgun, such as when consuming alcohol. Indiana law explicitly prohibits carrying a handgun while under the influence of alcohol or controlled substances, and this approach disregards that critical safety and legal mandate. Finally, an approach that prioritizes personal convenience over legal compliance, such as carrying a handgun in a prohibited area because it is deemed inconvenient to leave it secured elsewhere, is also professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a disregard for the law and the potential risks associated with unauthorized carrying. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the specific laws and regulations governing their actions. In Indiana, this means familiarizing oneself with the entirety of Indiana Code Title 35, Article 47, Chapter 11. 1. This framework should then involve a continuous assessment of the environment and circumstances to ensure compliance. Before carrying a handgun, a professional should ask, am I legally permitted to carry in this specific location? And am I in a condition, e.g., sober, that allows me to legally carry? This proactive and informed approach minimizes legal risks and upholds ethical responsibilities. Question 5. Risk assessment procedures indicate a licensed handgun carrier in Indiana is planning a visit to a state government building for a scheduled appointment. Considering the specific regulations governing the carrying of handguns in Indiana, what is the most prudent course of action to ensure compliance with Indiana law? Option A. Consult a friend who also carries a handgun in Indiana for their opinion on whether it is permissible to carry in government buildings. Option B. Verify the specific Indiana code provisions that prohibit carrying handguns in government buildings and refrain from carrying the handgun in that location. Option C. Assume that a valid Indiana license to carry handgun permits carrying in all government buildings as long as the appointment is legitimate. Option D. Carry the handgun discreetly and rely on the belief that law enforcement will not search for weapons in a government building unless a specific incident occurs. Correct answer is B. Verify the specific Indiana code provisions that prohibit carrying handguns in government buildings and refrain from carrying the handgun in that location. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge involving the interpretation and application of Indiana's license to carry handgun laws, specifically concerning the permissible locations for carrying a handgun. The challenge lies in navigating the nuances of statutory language and understanding the exceptions and prohibitions, which requires careful judgment to avoid legal violations. The individual's desire to carry a handgun for self-defense must be balanced against the strict legal framework established by the state. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough understanding of Indiana Code Title 35, Article 47, Chapter 5, which governs the carrying of handguns. Specifically, this approach requires recognizing that while a license to carry a handgun generally permits carrying in most public places, Indiana law explicitly prohibits carrying a handgun in certain locations, such as schools, courthouses, and government buildings where official business is conducted. Therefore, the correct approach is to identify and strictly adhere to these statutory prohibitions, ensuring the handgun is not carried in any location explicitly forbidden by Indiana law, even with a valid license. This aligns with the legal mandate to respect the boundaries set forth by the state legislature for public safety and order. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves assuming that a valid Indiana license to carry handgun permits carrying a handgun in all locations, without regard to specific statutory exceptions. This fails to acknowledge the detailed restrictions outlined in Indiana Code, leading to potential violations of the law. The ethical failure here is a disregard for legal obligations, which can have severe consequences. Another incorrect approach is to rely on informal advice or personal interpretations of the law rather than consulting the official Indiana Code. This can lead to misinterpretations and carrying a handgun in prohibited areas, demonstrating a lack of due diligence and a failure to uphold legal responsibilities. The ethical lapse is in prioritizing convenience over accurate legal compliance. A further incorrect approach is to believe that the right to carry a handgun for self-defense supersedes all statutory restrictions on location. While self-defense is a recognized right, it is not absolute and must be exercised within the bounds of the law. This approach demonstrates a misunderstanding of the balance between individual rights and public safety regulation, leading to potential legal entanglements. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should adopt a systematic approach to legal compliance. This involves 1. Identifying the relevant jurisdiction and its specific laws, in this case Indiana Code. 2. Thoroughly researching the statutes pertaining to the activity in question, license to carry handgun. 3. Consulting official legal resources and avoiding reliance on hearsay or informal advice. 4. Applying the law strictly to the specific circumstances, paying close attention to definitions, exceptions, and prohibitions. 5. Seeking clarification from legal counsel if any aspect of the law remains unclear. This methodical process ensures adherence to legal requirements and ethical responsibilities. Question 6. Benchmark analysis indicates that individuals seeking to obtain an Indiana license to carry a handgun must navigate specific legal requirements. Considering the provisions of Indiana law, which of the following represents the most prudent and legally compliant method for an applicant with a prior misdemeanor conviction from over 10 years ago to ensure their eligibility? Option A. Omit any mention of the prior misdemeanor conviction on the application, believing it is too old to be relevant. Option B. Rely on the advice of a friend who also has a handgun license and believes that old misdemeanors are generally not an issue in Indiana. Option C. Assume that a misdemeanor conviction from more than 10 years ago is no longer a disqualifier under Indiana law without further investigation. Option D. Thoroughly review Indiana Code 35-47-2-4 to determine if the specific misdemeanor conviction is listed as a disqualifier, and if unsure, contact the Indiana State Police for clarification. The correct answer is D. Thoroughly review Indiana Code 35-47-2-4 to determine if the specific misdemeanor conviction is listed as a disqualifier, and if unsure, contact the Indiana State Police for clarification. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an Indiana resident seeking to obtain a license to carry a handgun. The challenge lies in navigating the specific requirements and prohibitions outlined in Indiana law, particularly concerning prior convictions and the potential for misinterpreting eligibility criteria. A careful judgment is required to ensure all legal prerequisites are met to avoid a denial of the application and potential legal repercussions. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough and honest self-assessment of one's criminal history against the explicit disqualifiers listed in Indiana Code Title 35, Article 47, Chapter 2. Specifically, an applicant must review IC 35-47-2-4, which details the grounds for denial, including felony convictions, certain misdemeanor convictions within a specified time frame, and other disqualifying factors. By proactively identifying any potential disqualifiers and seeking clarification from the Indiana State Police if necessary, the applicant ensures they are proceeding in full compliance with the law. This approach prioritizes accuracy and adherence to statutory requirements, thereby maximizing the likelihood of a successful application and demonstrating responsible firearm ownership. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves assuming that a past conviction, even if seemingly minor or long ago, does not impact eligibility without verifying against the specific Indiana statutes. This overlooks the detailed nature of IC 35-47-2-4, which enumerates various offenses and timeframes that can disqualify an applicant. Relying on personal interpretation or hearsay rather than consulting the law is a significant regulatory failure. Another incorrect approach is to omit any mention of a past conviction on the application, believing it will go unnoticed or is irrelevant. This constitutes a direct violation of the application's truthfulness requirements and Indiana law. Applications for a license to carry a handgun require truthful and complete disclosure of all relevant information, and any attempt to conceal disqualifying factors is a serious offense, potentially leading to denial and criminal charges. A third incorrect approach is to rely solely on the advice of an acquaintance who has previously obtained a license, without independently verifying the legal requirements. While well-intentioned, such advice may not be accurate or may not account for the specific circumstances of the current applicant. This approach fails to meet the professional standard of due diligence required when navigating legal and regulatory processes. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing similar situations should adopt a systematic approach. First, identify the specific jurisdiction and the relevant governing statutes. In this case, Indiana Code Title 35, Article 47, Chapter 2. Second, meticulously review all eligibility criteria and disqualifying factors outlined in the law. Third, conduct an honest self-assessment of one's personal history against these criteria. Fourth, if any doubt or ambiguity exists, seek official clarification from the relevant issuing authority, the Indiana State Police, or consult with legal counsel specializing in firearm law. Finally, ensure all information provided on any application is truthful and complete. Question 7. Governance review demonstrates that an individual in Indiana who possesses a valid license to carry handgun finds themselves in a situation where they perceive a potential threat. Which of the following actions best aligns with the regulatory framework governing the license to carry handgun in Indiana? Option A. Immediately draw the handgun and confront the perceived threat, relying on the license to carry handgun as justification for any action taken. Option B. Assess the situation against Indiana's legal definition of imminent threat of death or great bodily harm and confirm the location is not a prohibited place for carrying a handgun, while ensuring the handgun is carried in compliance with Indiana law. Option C. Consult general online resources about self-defense laws in other states to determine the appropriate course of action. Option D. Assume that the license to carry handgun permits the use of the handgun in any situation where the individual feels threatened, regardless of the specific circumstances or location. The correct answer is B. Assess the situation against Indiana's legal definition of imminent threat of death or great bodily harm and confirm the location is not a prohibited place for carrying a handgun, while ensuring the handgun is carried in compliance with Indiana law. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to navigate the nuanced requirements of Indiana's license to carry handgun law while balancing personal safety concerns with legal obligations. The challenge lies in accurately interpreting and applying the law to a specific, potentially stressful situation, ensuring that actions taken are both lawful and justifiable under Indiana statutes. Misinterpretation can lead to severe legal consequences, including the denial or revocation of a license or even criminal charges. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a thorough understanding of Indiana Code Title 35, Article 47, Chapter 24, which governs the license to carry handgun. Specifically, this approach prioritizes identifying whether the individual's actions align with the legal definitions of self-defense and the permissible circumstances for carrying a handgun as outlined in Indiana law. This means confirming that the individual is not in a prohibited location, e.g., schools, courthouses, federal buildings, and that their possession and potential use of the handgun are in direct response to a reasonable and imminent threat of death or great bodily harm, as defined by Indiana's self-defense statutes. This approach is correct because it directly adheres to the legal framework established by the state, ensuring that the individual's conduct is compliant with the license to carry handgun requirements and relevant self-defense provisions. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves assuming that simply possessing a valid license to carry handgun automatically grants immunity from all legal scrutiny regarding the use of a firearm. This fails to recognize that the license permits carrying, but the use of the firearm is governed by separate, albeit related, self-defense laws. Another incorrect approach is to rely on generalized notions of self-defense without consulting the specific definitions and limitations provided by Indiana law, potentially leading to an overestimation of permissible actions. A third incorrect approach is to prioritize personal feelings of fear or perceived threat over the objective legal standard of imminent danger of death or great bodily harm, which is the threshold for lawful use of deadly force in Indiana. These approaches are incorrect because they deviate from the precise legal standards set forth in Indiana Code, risking legal repercussions. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with a comprehensive review of the relevant Indiana statutes, particularly those pertaining to the license to carry handgun and self-defense. This should be followed by an objective assessment of the situation, comparing the facts against the legal definitions and requirements. When in doubt, seeking clarification from legal counsel or relevant authorities is paramount. The focus must always be on strict adherence to the law and ethical considerations, ensuring that actions are both legally defensible and morally sound within the established legal framework. Question 8. Cost-benefit analysis shows that maintaining a valid Indiana license to carry a handgun requires understanding its limitations. If an individual with a valid Indiana license to carry a handgun encounters a person exhibiting aggressive body language and making hostile remarks across a public space, but without any overt physical action or direct threat of immediate harm, which of the following actions best aligns with Indiana law and responsible firearm practices? Option A. Approach the aggressive individual to verbally de-escalate the situation and assess their intentions. Option B. Immediately draw the handgun to deter the aggressive individual and prevent any potential escalation. Option C. Maintain situational awareness, avoid direct engagement, and only consider drawing a firearm if the individual initiates an immediate physical threat of death or great bodily harm. Option D. Assume the hostile remarks constitute an immediate threat and prepare to use the handgun if the individual moves closer. The correct answer is C. Maintain situational awareness, avoid direct engagement, and only consider drawing a firearm if the individual initiates an immediate physical threat of death or great bodily harm. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance the immediate need for self-defense with the legal obligations and responsibilities associated with carrying a handgun in Indiana. The core of the challenge lies in understanding and applying the specific requirements of Indiana law regarding the license to carry a handgun, particularly concerning situations where an individual might feel threatened, but has not yet been directly attacked. Misinterpreting these requirements can lead to serious legal consequences, including criminal charges and compromise public safety. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between a perceived threat and a situation that legally justifies the immediate brandishing or use of a firearm. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves prioritizing adherence to Indiana Code 35-47-2-1, which governs the licensing and carrying of handguns. This approach emphasizes understanding that a license to carry a handgun, LTCH, in Indiana is primarily for carrying a handgun, not for preemptively confronting perceived threats. The correct approach involves maintaining situational awareness, de-escalating potential conflicts if possible, and only resorting to the use of a firearm as a last resort in situations where there is an immediate and unavoidable threat of death or great bodily harm, as defined by Indiana law regarding self-defense. This means that even with a valid LTCH, an individual must still act within the bounds of self-defense statutes and cannot use the license as justification for aggressive or confrontational behavior based solely on a feeling of unease or a potential threat that has not materialized into an imminent danger. The license permits carrying, but the use of the weapon is governed by separate, stringent self-defense laws. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves believing that possessing a valid Indiana license to carry a handgun automatically grants the right to confront or challenge individuals who are perceived as a threat, even if no overt hostile action has been taken against the licensee. This fundamentally misunderstands the purpose of the license, which is to allow for the carrying of a handgun, not to empower the licensee to act as a vigilante or to engage in preemptive actions based on subjective feelings of threat. Such behavior could lead to charges of assault, disorderly conduct, or other offenses, as it exceeds the legal justification for the use of force. Another incorrect approach is to assume that any interaction that feels uncomfortable or potentially confrontational justifies drawing or displaying a handgun. Indiana law, like most jurisdictions, requires an imminent threat of serious harm. Simply feeling uneasy or being involved in a verbal dispute without any physical aggression or clear intent to cause death or great bodily harm does not meet the legal threshold for drawing a weapon. Doing so could be construed as brandishing a weapon unlawfully, which is a criminal offense in Indiana. A third incorrect approach is to disregard the importance of de-escalation techniques. While carrying a handgun legally, individuals are still expected to exercise sound judgment and attempt to avoid conflict. Relying solely on the presence of a firearm as a deterrent without attempting to de-escalate a situation, where feasible and safe to do so, demonstrates a lack of responsible gun ownership and can escalate a minor incident into a dangerous confrontation. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance, situational awareness, and responsible firearm handling. This involves thoroughly understanding Indiana Code 35-47-2-1 and the state self-defense statutes. When faced with a potentially threatening situation, the process should be: 1. Assess the immediate threat level. Is there an imminent danger of death or great bodily harm? 2. If a threat exists, consider de-escalation options if safe and feasible. 3. If de-escalation is not possible or effective, and the threat is imminent, then consider the legal justification for drawing a firearm. 4. Always be prepared to justify any action taken in accordance with Indiana law. The license to carry is a privilege, not a license to provoke or engage in aggressive behavior. Question 9. Implementation of responsible firearm practices in Indiana requires an understanding of how carrying a handgun intersects with private property rights. If an individual possesses a valid Indiana license to carry handgun and encounters a private business that has clearly posted a sign prohibiting firearms on its premises, what is the most appropriate course of action to ensure compliance with Indiana law and respect for property rights? Option A. Respect the posted signage and refrain from entering the private business with a handgun. Option B. Engage the business owner in a debate about the legality of their signage, asserting the right to carry under the license. Option C. Conceal the handgun and enter the private business, believing the license permits carrying regardless of posted signs. Option D. Carry the handgun openly and conspicuously, assuming the license overrides private property restrictions. The correct answer is A. Respect the posted signage and refrain from entering the private business with a handgun. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to navigate the nuanced requirements of Indiana's license to carry handgun law while facing a situation that could be misconstrued or lead to unintended legal consequences. The core challenge lies in understanding the scope of permissible actions when carrying a handgun, particularly in relation to private property and the rights of property owners. A careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with Indiana Code 35-47-2-1 etc., and to avoid actions that could be interpreted as unlawful carrying or brandishing. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves understanding that while Indiana law permits carrying a handgun under certain conditions, this right is not absolute and is subject to limitations, especially on private property where the owner may prohibit firearms. The correct approach, therefore, is to be aware of and respect posted signage indicating that firearms are prohibited. This aligns with Indiana law which, while granting a license to carry, does not override the rights of private property owners to set their own rules regarding firearms on their premises. Adhering to posted prohibitions demonstrates responsible gun ownership and respect for property rights, thereby avoiding potential legal entanglements and conflicts. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves assuming that a license to carry handgun automatically grants the right to carry a firearm anywhere, regardless of posted restrictions. This fails to acknowledge that private property owners have the right to prohibit firearms on their land, and ignoring such prohibitions can lead to trespassing charges or other legal ramifications under Indiana law. Another incorrect approach is to carry the handgun openly and conspicuously in an attempt to signal lawful intent, even when faced with a no firearms sign. While open carry may be permissible in some contexts in Indiana, it does not grant an exemption from private property restrictions. This approach risks escalating a situation and can be perceived as confrontational, potentially leading to a request to leave the premises or even law enforcement involvement. A third incorrect approach is to conceal the handgun and proceed onto the property despite the posted prohibition. While concealment might avoid immediate visual detection, it does not negate the violation of the property owner's rules. If discovered, this could be viewed as a deliberate attempt to circumvent the posted restrictions, potentially leading to more severe consequences than if the firearm had been openly carried or if the individual had simply respected the signage. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach situations involving firearm carry with a thorough understanding of applicable state laws and a commitment to respecting the rights of others. This includes understanding that licensing requirements are not a blanket authorization for carrying firearms in all locations. A decision-making framework should prioritize compliance with all relevant statutes and regulations, including those pertaining to private property rights. When faced with conflicting information or potential ambiguities, the safest and most legally sound course of action is to err on the side of caution and seek clarification, or avoid the situation altogether if it risks violating any laws or rules. Question 10. To address the challenge of accurately budgeting for firearm ownership in Indiana, a prospective handgun owner is considering the purchase of a firearm priced at $550. They also plan to purchase a gun safe for $150, 10 boxes of ammunition at $15 per box, and anticipate paying 7% Indiana sales tax on the handgun and gun safe. If they plan to practice shooting regularly, requiring an estimated $200 in additional ammunition within the first year, what is the total estimated cost of acquiring and owning the handgun for the first year? Option A, $750, 00. Option B, $945, 00. Option C, $800, 00. Option D, $995, 00. The correct answer is D, $995, 00. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a licensed individual in Indiana who is considering purchasing a firearm. The challenge lies in accurately calculating the total cost of firearm ownership, including the firearm itself, necessary accessories, and ongoing expenses, to ensure financial preparedness and responsible decision-making, aligning with the principles of prudent financial management that underpin responsible firearm ownership. The Indiana License to Carry Handgun exam, while optional, emphasizes responsible gun ownership, which includes financial responsibility. Correct approach analysis. The best approach involves a comprehensive calculation of all immediate and anticipated costs. This includes the purchase price of the handgun, the cost of a secure storage device, e.g., a gun safe or lockbox, as mandated by responsible gun ownership practices, ammunition for practice and potential self-defense, and any applicable taxes or fees associated with the purchase in Indiana. Furthermore, it necessitates estimating the recurring costs of ammunition for practice and potential maintenance. This method ensures a realistic understanding of the financial commitment, preventing impulsive purchases that could lead to financial strain and potentially compromise the safe storage or responsible use of the firearm. This aligns with the spirit of responsible gun ownership, which implicitly includes financial prudence. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to only consider the sticker price of the handgun. This fails to account for essential safety equipment, ammunition, and taxes, leading to an incomplete and misleading financial picture. It neglects the practical necessities for safe and legal firearm ownership in Indiana. Another incorrect approach is to focus solely on the initial purchase price and the cost of a single box of ammunition. This underestimates the ongoing costs of practice and training, which are crucial for maintaining proficiency and safe handling. It also ignores the significant expense of secure storage. A third incorrect approach is to estimate costs based on anecdotal information or the price of a single accessory without a systematic calculation. This lacks the rigor needed for accurate financial planning and can lead to significant underestimation of the total financial outlay. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a systematic, itemized budgeting approach. This involves identifying all direct and indirect costs associated with firearm acquisition and ownership. For each item, research current market prices in Indiana and factor in applicable taxes and fees. For recurring costs like ammunition, estimate usage based on intended practice frequency and current ammunition prices. This structured method ensures all financial aspects are considered, promoting informed and responsible decision-making. Question 11. The review process indicates that an applicant for renewal of their Indiana license to carry a handgun has a prior misdemeanor conviction for domestic battery. The superintendent of the Indiana State Police is tasked with determining eligibility. Which of the following actions best reflects the superintendent's duty and discretion under Indiana law? Option A. Deny the renewal based on the conviction and advise the applicant to seek legal counsel to understand general firearm prohibition laws, without conducting a specific review of Indiana's statutory exceptions. Option B. Automatically deny the renewal application because any misdemeanor conviction for domestic battery permanently disqualifies an individual from obtaining a handgun license in Indiana. Option C. Review the specific details of the misdemeanor conviction to determine if it falls under any statutory exceptions for eligibility, such as expungement or restoration of civil rights, before making a final decision. Option D. Grant the renewal immediately, assuming that a misdemeanor conviction does not pose a significant risk to public safety for the purpose of carrying a handgun. Correct answer is C. Review the specific details of the misdemeanor conviction to determine if it falls under any statutory exceptions for eligibility, such as expungement or restoration of civil rights, before making a final decision. Explanation. The review process indicates a scenario involving an individual seeking to renew their Indiana license to carry a handgun, where a past misdemeanor conviction for domestic battery has resurfaced during the background check. This situation is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of Indiana's specific firearm laws and the discretion afforded to the superintendent of the Indiana State Police, balancing public safety concerns with individual rights. Careful judgment is required to navigate the legal framework and determine the appropriate course of action based on the nature of the offense and the statutory provisions. The correct approach involves the superintendent of the Indiana State Police exercising their statutory discretion to review the specific circumstances of the misdemeanor conviction. Indiana Code 35-47-2-3 I. Grants the superintendent the authority to issue a handgun license unless the applicant is prohibited by law from possessing a handgun. While a misdemeanor conviction for domestic battery is generally a disqualifying factor under federal law 18 U.S.C. Section 922G(9), Indiana law provides a specific exception under IC 35-47-2-3 I.2, which states that the prohibition does not apply if the conviction has been expunged or set aside, or if the applicant's civil rights have been restored. The superintendent must assess whether the applicant's specific conviction falls under any of these exceptions, or if there are other mitigating factors that warrant a waiver, while still prioritizing public safety. This approach aligns with the legislative intent to allow for individualized assessments in certain circumstances. An incorrect approach would be to automatically deny the renewal solely based on the misdemeanor conviction without further review. This fails to acknowledge the discretionary powers granted to the superintendent under Indiana law and the potential for expungement or restoration of civil rights, which could render the applicant eligible. Another incorrect approach would be to grant the renewal without a thorough investigation into the specifics of the conviction and whether it meets any of the statutory exceptions. This would disregard the public safety implications of a domestic violence conviction and potentially violate the spirit of firearm regulations. Finally, an approach that relies on general assumptions about all misdemeanor domestic battery convictions being disqualifying, without consulting the specific Indiana statutes and case law, would be a failure to adhere to the precise legal framework governing handgun licenses in Indiana. Professionals in this situation should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance, thorough investigation, and reasoned judgment. This involves 1. Identifying the relevant statutes and regulations, Indiana Code 35-47-2-3 and related federal laws. 2. Gathering all pertinent information about the applicant's conviction, including the date, specific offense, and any subsequent legal actions, e.g., expungement, restoration of rights. 3. Applying the statutory criteria to the gathered facts, considering any discretionary powers granted. 4. Documenting the decision-making process and the rationale behind the final determination. Question 12. Examination of the data shows that an Indiana resident who holds a valid license to carry handgun is planning a day trip to Brown County State Park. The individual is concerned about personal safety and wishes to carry their handgun for protection. What is the most responsible and legally compliant course of action for this individual regarding carrying their handgun within the park? Option A. Assume that carrying a handgun is permissible in all public areas in Indiana as long as a valid license is held. Option B. Proceed with carrying the handgun, assuming it is legal unless explicit "no guns allowed" signage is posted. Option C. Verify Indiana state park regulations and the Indiana Code to determine if state parks are designated as prohibited areas for licensed handgun carriers. Option D. Rely on personal feelings of safety and the perceived threat level within the park to decide whether to carry the handgun. The correct answer is C. Verify Indiana state park regulations and the Indiana Code to determine if state parks are designated as prohibited areas for licensed handgun carriers. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to make a judgment call regarding the legality and appropriateness of carrying a handgun in a public place, specifically a state park in Indiana. The challenge lies in interpreting and applying Indiana's license to carry handgun, LTCH, laws, which have specific provisions and restrictions, to a real-world situation where personal safety might be a concern, but legal compliance is paramount. Misinterpreting these laws can lead to serious legal consequences, including criminal charges and the revocation of a handgun license. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough understanding and strict adherence to Indiana Code Title 35, Article 47, Chapter 10, which governs the license to carry handgun. This approach prioritizes confirming that the specific location within the state park is not an explicitly prohibited area under Indiana law for licensed handgun carriers. It involves consulting official Indiana state park regulations and the Indiana Code to verify if state parks are designated as prohibited places, or if specific restrictions apply to licensed carriers within these areas. This approach ensures legal compliance by actively seeking definitive information about the legality of carrying a handgun in that precise context, rather than making assumptions. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that because a license is held, carrying a handgun is permissible in all public areas, including state parks. This fails to acknowledge that Indiana law, like many jurisdictions, designates certain locations as prohibited for handgun carry, even for licensed individuals. This approach risks violating specific provisions of Indiana Code Title 35, Article 47, Chapter 10. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on personal feelings of safety or the perceived threat level in the park. While personal safety is a valid concern, it does not override legal statutes. Making a decision based on subjective feelings without verifying legal permissibility is a significant ethical and legal failure. A further incorrect approach is to assume that if no explicit signage is present prohibiting handguns, it is therefore legal to carry one. The absence of signage does not equate to legal permission. Indiana law outlines specific prohibited places, and ignorance of these prohibitions or reliance on the lack of signage is not a valid legal defense. Professional reasoning. Professionals faced with this situation should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal research and verification. This involves 1. Identifying the relevant jurisdiction and its specific laws, Indiana Code Title 35, Article 47, Chapter 10. 2. Determining the specific location and its classification under those laws, e.g., is a state park a prohibited place? 3. Consulting official sources for clarification, Indiana Code State Park Regulations. 4. Making a decision based on verified legal permissibility, not assumptions or subjective feelings. This systematic approach ensures compliance and responsible conduct. Question 13. Upon reviewing the requirements for obtaining a license to carry handgun in Indiana, an applicant recalls a minor arrest several years ago that did not result in a conviction, as the charges were dismissed. Considering this past legal interaction, what is the most prudent course of action for the applicant when completing the official application form? Option A. Only disclose arrests that the applicant believes are definitively disqualifying according to their understanding of Indiana firearm laws. Option B. Omit the arrest from the application, assuming that a dismissed charge is not relevant to handgun permit eligibility in Indiana. Option C. Rely on advice from online forums and friends who suggest that dismissed charges are never a barrier to obtaining a handgun permit in Indiana. Option D. Fully disclose the arrest and dismissal on the application, providing any requested details, and consult the Indiana Code for specific disqualifying offenses. The correct answer is D. Fully disclose the arrest and dismissal on the application, providing any requested details, and consult the Indiana Code for specific disqualifying offenses. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for individuals seeking to obtain or maintain a license to carry handgun in Indiana. The challenge lies in navigating the legal requirements for eligibility, particularly concerning past legal entanglements, and understanding how these might impact their application. It requires careful consideration of Indiana code provisions related to firearm permits and a clear understanding of what constitutes disqualifying offenses. The professional challenge is to accurately assess one's own eligibility based on the law, rather than making assumptions or relying on incomplete information. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves proactively and accurately disclosing all relevant information to the Indiana State Police, including past arrests, even if charges were dismissed or the individual believes they are not disqualifying. This aligns with the principle of full and truthful disclosure mandated by Indiana law for firearm permit applications. Indiana Code Section 35-47-2-3 outlines the application process and requires applicants to provide information about their criminal history. By consulting the Indiana Code and honestly reporting all past legal interactions, the applicant demonstrates compliance and allows the authorities to make an informed decision based on the established legal criteria. This approach prioritizes transparency and adherence to the regulatory framework. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that a dismissed charge or an arrest that did not result in a conviction is not relevant and therefore omit it from the application. This is a failure to comply with the spirit and letter of Indiana law, which often requires disclosure of all arrests and legal proceedings, regardless of the final outcome. The Indiana State Police have the authority to review all such information to determine eligibility. Failing to disclose can lead to denial of the permit and potential penalties for providing false information. Another incorrect approach is to rely on informal advice from friends or online forums regarding eligibility. Such advice is not legally binding and may be inaccurate or outdated. Indiana law is specific, and interpretations can vary. Making decisions based on hearsay rather than consulting the official Indiana Code and the application instructions provided by the Indiana State Police is a significant regulatory failure. A third incorrect approach is to only disclose arrests that the applicant believes are clearly disqualifying. This demonstrates a misunderstanding of the application process, which requires comprehensive disclosure. The Indiana State Police are responsible for determining what constitutes a disqualifying offense based on the entirety of the applicant's history. Attempting to preemptively filter information based on personal interpretation is a violation of the disclosure requirements. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes accuracy, transparency, and adherence to legal requirements. This involves 1. Thoroughly reviewing the relevant Indiana Code sections pertaining to license to carry handgun eligibility and application procedures. 2. Consulting the official application materials and instructions provided by the Indiana State Police. 3. Honestly and completely disclosing all requested information, including any past arrests, charges, or legal proceedings, regardless of their perceived significance or outcome. 4. Seeking clarification from the Indiana State Police directly if there are any doubts about disclosure requirements or eligibility. Question 14. When evaluating a situation where a license to carry handgun holder in Indiana perceives a potential threat, what is the most prudent course of action to ensure compliance with Indiana law and ethical responsibilities? Option A. Assess the situation for an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm. Prioritize de-escalation and avoidance if possible, and only consider the use of a handgun as a last resort when legally justified. Option B. Assume that any aggressive behavior directed towards oneself warrants the immediate use of the handgun to protect one's personal space. Option C. Engage verbally with the perceived aggressor to assert one's rights as a license to carry handgun holder, potentially escalating the confrontation. Option D. Display the handgun to deter any perceived aggressor, even if the threat is not immediate or severe. The correct answer is A. Assess the situation for an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm, prioritize de-escalation and avoidance if possible, and only consider the use of a handgun as a last resort when legally justified. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the legal obligations and responsibilities associated with carrying a handgun in Indiana. The core challenge lies in accurately assessing a threat and determining if the use of deadly force is justified under Indiana law, while also considering the potential legal and ethical ramifications of their actions. Misjudgment can lead to severe legal consequences, including criminal charges and civil liability, as well as ethical condemnation. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough understanding and strict adherence to Indiana Code Title 35, Article 43, Article 6, specifically concerning the lawful use of force. This approach prioritizes de-escalation and avoidance of conflict whenever possible, recognizing that the use of a handgun should be an absolute last resort. It mandates that a person must have a reasonable belief that deadly force is necessary to prevent death or great bodily harm to themselves or another person. This aligns with the legal standard in Indiana, which allows for the use of deadly force only when there is an imminent threat of serious harm and no reasonable alternative exists. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that possessing a license to carry handgun in Indiana grants carte blanche to use the firearm in any situation perceived as uncomfortable or inconvenient. This fails to recognize that the license permits carrying, not indiscriminate use. Indiana law clearly defines the specific circumstances under which deadly force is justified, and acting outside these parameters constitutes a violation of the law. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on a subjective feeling of fear without an objective, imminent threat of death or great bodily harm. While fear is a natural response, Indiana law requires a reasonable belief based on the totality of the circumstances that such harm is about to occur. Acting solely on a generalized sense of unease, without a concrete and immediate danger, is not legally defensible. A third incorrect approach is to escalate a verbal dispute into a physical confrontation involving the display or use of a handgun. Indiana law does not permit the use of deadly force to resolve disagreements or to intimidate others. The focus must remain on imminent threats to life or serious bodily injury, and any action taken must be proportionate to the threat faced. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that emphasizes situational awareness, threat assessment, and adherence to legal statutes. This involves constantly evaluating the environment for potential dangers, understanding the legal boundaries of self-defense, and prioritizing de-escalation and escape routes. When a threat is perceived, the individual must objectively assess its imminence and severity, determining if the use of deadly force is the only reasonable means to prevent death or great bodily harm, in strict accordance with Indiana Code. Question 15. The analysis reveals that an individual residing in Indiana is considering carrying a handgun for personal protection. What is the most legally sound and professionally responsible course of action to ensure compliance with Indiana's firearm regulations? Option A. Rely on a valid hunting license or a permit from another state to carry a handgun in Indiana. Option B. Obtain a valid Indiana license to carry a handgun. Option C. Carry the handgun unloaded and in a case, believing this negates the need for a license in public. Option D. Assume that general handgun possession laws in Indiana permit carrying without a specific license. The correct answer is B. Obtain a valid Indiana license to carry a handgun. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to make a critical decision regarding the lawful possession and potential use of a handgun in Indiana, directly impacting personal safety and legal compliance. The individual must navigate the specific requirements of Indiana law concerning the license to carry a handgun, balancing the right to self-defense with the legal obligations to obtain and maintain proper authorization. Misinterpreting or disregarding these regulations can lead to severe legal consequences, including criminal charges and the loss of the right to carry a handgun. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves proactively understanding and adhering to Indiana's legal framework for carrying a handgun. This means recognizing that while Indiana law generally permits the carrying of handguns, specific conditions and requirements must be met, particularly for carrying a handgun openly or concealed in public places. The most prudent and legally compliant approach is to obtain a valid Indiana license to carry a handgun. This license signifies that the applicant has met the state's criteria, including background checks and training, and grants the legal authority to carry a handgun under specified conditions. This approach prioritizes legal compliance and responsible firearm ownership, minimizing the risk of violating Indiana code. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that because Indiana law generally permits handgun possession, no specific license is required for carrying one in public. This overlooks the nuances of Indiana code, which mandates a license for carrying a handgun, whether openly or concealed, in most public settings. Relying on a general understanding without consulting the specific statutes is a significant legal misstep. Another incorrect approach is to believe that a valid hunting license or a permit from another state automatically satisfies Indiana's requirements for carrying a handgun. Indiana law has specific provisions for its license to carry a handgun, and reciprocity agreements with other states, while they exist, do not negate the need for an Indiana license if one is required for carrying in Indiana. A hunting license is for a different purpose and does not confer the right to carry a handgun for self-defense. A further incorrect approach is to carry a handgun without any license, believing that as long as it is unloaded and stored in a case, it is permissible. While there are specific exceptions for transporting unloaded firearms in a vehicle, this does not extend to carrying a handgun openly or concealed in public without a license. The law distinguishes between transportation and carrying for the purpose of immediate use or defense. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal research and compliance. This involves 1. Identifying the specific legal jurisdiction, Indiana. 2. Researching the relevant statutes and regulations pertaining to the activity, carrying a handgun. 3. Understanding the conditions and requirements for lawful execution of the activity, obtaining a license to carry a handgun. 4. Choosing the course of action that demonstrably meets all legal mandates. In this case, the framework leads directly to the necessity of obtaining the appropriate Indiana license. Question 16. Comparative studies suggest that when applying for an Indiana license to carry handgun, applicants often face challenges in articulating a proper purpose. Considering the Indiana Code, which of the following approaches best demonstrates a legally defensible and professionally sound justification for carrying a handgun? Option A. To carry a handgun for personal protection and to exercise constitutional rights. Option B. To carry a handgun to deter potential criminal activity in the applicant's neighborhood. Option C. To protect oneself and one's family while traveling to and from a place of employment where the applicant handles cash transactions and has previously experienced a robbery at a similar business. Option D. To carry a handgun at all times for general self-defense because the applicant feels unsafe in public. The correct answer is C. To protect oneself and one's family while traveling to and from a place of employment where the applicant handles cash transactions and has previously experienced a robbery at a similar business. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for individuals seeking to obtain a license to carry handgun in Indiana. The core difficulty lies in navigating the legal requirements for demonstrating a proper purpose for carrying a handgun, especially when the applicant's stated reason might be perceived as subjective or potentially open to misinterpretation by law enforcement or licensing authorities. The applicant must articulate a reason that aligns with the statutory definitions and judicial interpretations of proper purpose under Indiana law, avoiding justifications that could be construed as pretexts for unlawful intent or unnecessary escalation of minor disputes. Careful judgment is required to ensure the stated purpose is both truthful and legally defensible. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves clearly and truthfully articulating a purpose that is explicitly recognized or implicitly supported by Indiana Code provisions related to the license to carry handgun. This includes reasons such as self-defense, protection of family, or lawful business activities that inherently carry a risk of harm. The applicant should be prepared to provide specific, factual details that substantiate this purpose, demonstrating a genuine need rather than a generalized desire for personal protection without a specific, articulable threat or context. This approach directly addresses the statutory requirement for a proper purpose by grounding the request in legally permissible justifications. Incorrect approach is analysis. Stating a generalized desire for personal protection without any specific context or articulable threat fails to meet the proper purpose requirement. Indiana law requires more than a vague feeling of insecurity. It necessitates a demonstrable reason that aligns with lawful activities or recognized threats. This approach is legally insufficient because it lacks the specificity and factual basis required by statute. Claiming the purpose is to carry wherever one goes for peace of mind, is also problematic. While peace of mind is a desirable outcome, it is not a legally recognized proper purpose for carrying a handgun under Indiana law. This justification is subjective and does not demonstrate a specific need or lawful activity that necessitates carrying a firearm. Asserting the purpose is to deter potential criminals is an overreach. While deterrence may be a secondary effect of carrying a firearm, it is not the primary legal justification for obtaining a license. The focus must be on the applicant's direct need for self-defense or protection in specific, lawful circumstances, not on acting as an informal law enforcement agent. This approach misinterprets the intent of the law, which is to permit responsible citizens to carry for their own lawful protection, not to empower them to proactively confront perceived threats. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Indiana seeking a license to carry handguns should approach the application process with a clear understanding of the proper purpose requirement as defined by Indiana Code. The decision-making framework should prioritize honesty, specificity, and alignment with statutory intent. Applicants should 1. Understand the legal definition of proper purpose in Indiana, consulting relevant statutes and official guidance. 2. Identify a specific, lawful activity or circumstance that necessitates carrying a handgun for protection. 3. Be prepared to articulate this purpose with factual details and avoid vague or subjective justifications. 4. Ensure the stated purpose does not imply intent to engage in unlawful activities or to act outside the scope of self-defense. 5. If unsure, seek clarification from the Indiana State Police or legal counsel specializing in firearms law. Question 17. The investigation demonstrates that an individual in Indiana has obtained a license to carry a handgun. Considering the specific legal framework governing handgun carry in Indiana, which of the following best reflects the understanding of where a licensed individual may legally carry a handgun? Option A. A license to carry a handgun in Indiana means the holder can carry a handgun anywhere they feel it is necessary for personal protection, regardless of specific location restrictions. Option B. A license to carry a handgun in Indiana permits carrying in most public places, but it is crucial to be aware of and adhere to specific locations where carrying is statutorily prohibited, such as schools and courthouses. Option C. A license to carry a handgun in Indiana allows carrying in public, but it is acceptable to carry in most prohibited locations as long as the handgun is concealed. Option D. A license to carry a handgun in Indiana grants the right to carry a firearm in any public place, as the license signifies the holder is deemed responsible enough for unrestricted carry. Correct answer is B. A license to carry a handgun in Indiana permits carrying in most public places, but it is crucial to be aware of and adhere to specific locations where carrying is statutorily prohibited, such as schools and courthouses. Explanation. The investigation demonstrates a scenario where an individual, having recently obtained a license to carry a handgun in Indiana, is seeking to understand the nuances of legal firearm possession in public spaces. The professional challenge lies in interpreting the scope of Indiana's license to carry handgun law, specifically regarding where a licensed individual may and may not carry a handgun. This requires careful judgment to avoid violations that could lead to legal penalties and endanger public safety. The best professional practice involves a thorough understanding of the specific prohibitions outlined in Indiana Code Section 35-47-11. 3. This approach prioritizes adherence to the letter of the law by recognizing that, while a license permits carrying, it does not grant unfettered access to all locations. Specifically, it acknowledges that carrying a handgun is prohibited in certain sensitive places, such as schools, courthouses, and government buildings, as detailed in the statute. This is correct because the Indiana Code explicitly lists these locations as prohibited areas for licensed handgun carriers, and compliance with these specific statutory restrictions is paramount for lawful firearm possession. An incorrect approach would be to assume that a license to carry a handgun in Indiana grants the right to carry a firearm in any public place without exception. This fails to acknowledge the statutory limitations and prohibitions clearly defined in Indiana law. Such an assumption could lead to unknowingly carrying a handgun into a prohibited location, resulting in criminal charges. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on general advice or anecdotal information from other gun owners regarding carrying locations. While peer advice can sometimes be helpful, It is not a substitute for understanding the specific legal requirements of Indiana. Misinformation or outdated information could lead to serious legal consequences. A further incorrect approach would be to interpret the license as a blanket permission to carry a handgun anywhere the individual feels it is necessary for self-defense, without consulting the specific legal restrictions. This approach prioritizes personal judgment over legal mandates and disregards the legislative intent behind establishing prohibited locations, which are designed to enhance public safety in specific environments. The professional reasoning framework for such situations involves a multi-step process. First, always consult the most current and official legal statutes of the relevant jurisdiction, in this case, Indiana Code. Second, identify the specific rights granted by the license, and crucially, the explicit prohibitions and restrictions associated with that license. Third, seek clarification from official sources, such as law enforcement agencies or legal counsel, if any aspect of the law is unclear. Finally, prioritize strict adherence to the law to ensure both personal legal compliance and public safety. Question 18. Analysis of a tense verbal altercation in a public parking lot in Indiana, where an individual feels threatened by another person's aggressive posture and verbal insults, but no physical contact has been made and no weapons are visible. What is the most appropriate course of action for a licensed handgun carrier? Option A. Engage verbally with the aggressor to assert dominance and resolve the dispute. Option B. Immediately draw the handgun to deter the aggressor and prevent the situation from escalating further. Option C. Leave the area immediately, even if it means abandoning personal property that might be the subject of the dispute. Option D. Assess the situation for an immediate threat of death or great bodily harm, considering if de-escalation or safe retreat is possible before considering any defensive action. The correct answer is D. Assess the situation for an immediate threat of death or great bodily harm, considering if de-escalation or safe retreat is possible before considering any defensive action. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the legal obligations and responsibilities associated with carrying a handgun in Indiana. The core challenge lies in accurately assessing a threat and determining if the use of deadly force is legally justified and ethically sound, all while under extreme duress. Misjudgment can lead to severe legal consequences, including criminal charges and civil liability, as well as profound ethical repercussions. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough and immediate assessment of the situation to determine if the threat meets the legal standard for the use of deadly force in Indiana. This means evaluating if there is an immediate threat of death or great bodily harm to oneself or another person. If such a threat exists, the individual must then consider if there are any reasonable means of escape or de-escalation available. The Indiana Code, specifically IC 35-41-4-1, outlines the justification for using deadly force, which is limited to situations where the person reasonably believes such force is necessary to prevent death or great bodily harm to themselves or another person, or to prevent the commission of a forcible felony. This approach prioritizes legal compliance and ethical responsibility by ensuring that the use of a handgun is a last resort, justified by an imminent and severe threat, and not an impulsive reaction. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately draw the handgun and aim it at the perceived threat without a clear and immediate threat of death or great bodily harm. This action escalates the situation unnecessarily and could be interpreted as an aggressive act rather than a defensive one, violating the principle that deadly force is only justified as a last resort. Indiana law requires a reasonable belief of imminent danger, not mere fear or annoyance. Another incorrect approach is to retreat from the situation even when there is a clear and immediate threat of death or great bodily harm, and retreat is not safely possible. While Indiana law does not impose a strict duty to retreat in all circumstances, especially when inside one's home, it does require that the use of force be reasonable. If a person can safely retreat from a dangerous situation without resorting to deadly force, doing so is generally considered the more prudent and ethically sound course of action, and failure to do so when possible could be scrutinized. However, if retreat is not safely possible, the justification for using force increases. The failure here is not considering the feasibility and safety of retreat when it is a viable option to avoid the necessity of using deadly force. A further incorrect approach is to use the handgun to intimidate or threaten an individual who poses no immediate threat of death or great bodily harm, such as during a verbal dispute or a minor property crime. This constitutes an unlawful display of a firearm and can lead to criminal charges, as it goes far beyond the legal justification for carrying a handgun for self-defense. It demonstrates a severe misunderstanding of the legal and ethical boundaries of firearm possession and use. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes de-escalation and avoidance of conflict whenever possible. When a confrontation arises, the framework should guide an assessment of the threat level, considering the imminence and severity of danger. This involves asking, is there an immediate threat of death or great bodily harm? Are there safe and reasonable alternatives to using deadly force, such as retreat or de-escalation? If deadly force appears necessary, is it proportionate to the threat? This systematic evaluation, grounded in Indiana law and ethical principles, ensures that actions taken are legally justifiable and morally responsible. Question 19. Consider a scenario where an individual in Indiana, possessing a valid license to carry handgun, inquires about the legality of carrying their firearm into a community center that also houses a local government office. What is the most appropriate professional guidance to provide? Option A. Inform the individual that as long as they have a valid license to carry handgun, they are permitted to carry their firearm in any public place, including the community center. Option B. Advise the individual to review Indiana Code IC 35-47-11. 3. To identify specific locations where carrying a handgun is prohibited, as the license to carry handgun does not permit carrying in all places. Option C. Recommend that the individual use their personal discretion to determine if the community center is a safe or appropriate place to carry a handgun. Option D. Suggest that to avoid any potential legal issues, the individual should refrain from carrying their handgun in any public facility, such as the community center. The correct answer is B. Advise the individual to review Indiana Code IC 35-47-11. 3. To identify specific locations where carrying a handgun is prohibited, as the license to carry handgun does not permit carrying in all places. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge involving a potential violation of Indiana's license to carry handgun, LTCH, regulations. The core difficulty lies in balancing the individual's right to self-defense with the legal restrictions on carrying firearms in specific locations. A professional in this situation must accurately interpret and apply Indiana law to avoid aiding or abetting an illegal act, while also respecting an individual's lawful rights. Misinterpreting the law or failing to verify the legality of carrying a handgun in a particular place could have serious legal consequences for both the individual and anyone who provides advice or assistance. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves advising the individual to consult the specific Indiana statutes that define prohibited places for carrying a handgun. This approach is correct because Indiana law, under IC 35-47-11, 3, clearly outlines locations where carrying a handgun is prohibited, even with a valid LTCH. These include, but are not limited to, schools, courthouses, and government buildings. A professional's duty is to guide individuals towards understanding and complying with the law, not to make definitive legal pronouncements or assumptions. Directing the individual to the relevant statutes empowers them to make an informed decision based on the precise legal framework. Incorrect approaches analysis. Advising the individual that carrying a handgun is permissible as long as they have a valid Indiana license to carry handgun is an incorrect approach. This fails to acknowledge that the LTCH grants the privilege to carry, but it does not override specific statutory prohibitions on carrying in certain locations. This advice could lead to a violation of Indiana law. Suggesting that the individual should rely on their personal judgment about whether a location is safe or appropriate for carrying a handgun is also an incorrect approach. Indiana law is specific and does not permit subjective interpretations of safety or appropriateness to override explicit prohibitions. This approach ignores the legal framework and could result in illegal carrying. Recommending that the individual avoid carrying a handgun in any public place to err on the side of caution is an overly restrictive and incorrect approach. While caution is important, Indiana law permits carrying in many public places, provided they are not statutorily prohibited. This advice unnecessarily curtails a lawful right without a basis in the specific regulations. Professional reasoning. Professionals dealing with inquiries about firearm carry laws in Indiana should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal accuracy and empowers the individual with knowledge. This framework involves 1. Identifying the core legal question. Is it lawful to carry a handgun in a specific location under Indiana law? 2. Consulting the relevant statutory authority. In this case, Indiana Code Title 35, Article 47, Chapter 11. 3. License to carry handgun. 3. Providing guidance, not definitive legal advice. Direct individuals to the law itself and explain the general principles, emphasizing that specific locations are detailed in the statutes. 4. Avoiding assumptions or subjective interpretations. Do not rely on personal judgment or generalized advice when specific legal prohibitions exist. 5. Encouraging verification. Advise the individual to verify the legality of carrying in their intended location by reviewing the statute. Question 20. During the evaluation of a candidate's performance on the Indiana license to carry handgun proficiency test, the instructor recorded that the candidate fired 50 rounds, with 38 rounds hitting the designated scoring area of the target. The scoring rubric for the Indiana LTCH exam states that a minimum of 75% of shots must hit the scoring area to demonstrate proficiency. What is the candidate's percentage of shots hitting the scoring area, and do they meet the minimum proficiency requirement? Option A. The candidate hit 74% of the shots in the scoring area and does not meet the minimum proficiency requirement. Option B. The candidate hit 76% of the shots in the scoring area and meets the minimum proficiency requirement. Option C. The candidate hit 75% of the shots in the scoring area and meets the minimum proficiency requirement. Option D. The candidate hit 76% of the shots in the scoring area but does not meet the minimum proficiency requirement due to a rounding discrepancy. The correct answer is B. The candidate hit 76% of the shots in the scoring area and meets the minimum proficiency requirement. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge involving the accurate calculation of firearm proficiency scores under Indiana law, specifically concerning the license to carry handgun (LTCH) exam. The challenge lies in correctly interpreting scoring guidelines and applying them to a given set of performance metrics, ensuring compliance with Indiana Code IC 35-47-2-3, which outlines the requirements for handgun proficiency. Misinterpreting the scoring or miscalculating the final score could lead to an inaccurate assessment of an applicant's qualification, potentially impacting their eligibility for an LTCH. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves meticulously calculating the score based on the number of shots fired, the number of shots hitting the target, and the designated scoring zones, then comparing this to the minimum passing score established by Indiana law. This approach ensures adherence to the specific proficiency standards mandated by IC 35-47-2-3. The calculation would involve determining the percentage of shots on target and then applying the scoring rubric. For instance, if 50 shots were fired and 35 hit the target, the percentage on target is /frac 3550 times 100 % equals 70 %. If the passing threshold requires 75% accuracy, this would not meet the requirement. This method directly addresses the legal requirements for demonstrating handgun proficiency. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to simply count the number of shots that hit the target without considering the total number of shots fired or the scoring zones, and then compare this raw count to a subjective standard. This fails to adhere to the quantitative requirements of Indiana law, which necessitates a calculated percentage of accuracy. Another incorrect approach would be to assume a passing score based on a general understanding of marksmanship, without consulting the specific scoring criteria outlined for the Indiana LTCH exam. This bypasses the detailed regulatory framework and introduces an element of personal judgment that is not permitted when objective legal standards exist. A further incorrect approach would be to round down the calculated percentage of shots on target to the nearest whole number if it falls below a threshold, even if the actual decimal value would have met the requirement. For example, if the calculation resulted in 74.9%, rounding down to 74% would incorrectly deem the applicant as not proficient, whereas the precise calculation might be interpreted differently based on specific Indiana guidelines for rounding or minimum thresholds. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a systematic, data-driven approach. First, understand the specific legal requirements for proficiency in Indiana, including the total number of rounds, the target scoring zones, and the minimum passing score percentage as per IC 35-47-2-3. Second, accurately record all performance data. Third, perform the calculation precisely, using the formula for percentage. Backslash text percentage equals backslash text shots on target text total shots fired times 100 %. Fourth, compare the calculated percentage to the legal minimum passing score. If the calculation is complex or involves fractions of points, refer to any official Indiana guidelines on scoring interpretation or rounding. This methodical process ensures objectivity and compliance with legal mandates.